The piercing whistle of a train rattled the windows of Hollow Creek's general store as Harriet James clutched the edge of the counter, her knuckles white against the weathered wood. The doctor's words still rang in her ears, delivered with clinical detachment just an hour before. "I'm afraid you cannot bear children, Miss James." Her entire future had collapsed in that small, sterile room at the edge of town. The year was 1876, and Hollow Creek was a dusty dot on the Arizona Territory map, the kind of place where news traveled faster than tumbleweeds in a windstorm. By sundown, everyone would know. "That'll be 35 cents for the sugar and flour," Mr. Wilkins said, his voice uncommonly gentle. The pity in his eyes told Harriet he already knew. She slid the coins across the counter, avoiding his gaze. "Thank you, Harriet," he called as she turned to leave. "Don't you pay them no mind. You're worth more than what folks might say." A lump formed in her throat. She nodded curtly and pushed through the door into the harsh afternoon sun, clutching her small parcel to her chest. The doctor had seemed almost apologetic when he'd explained that the fever she'd suffered as a child had damaged her womb. Almost, but not quite. In Hollow Creek, a woman's primary value was measured by the children she could bear. She walked briskly down the main street, dust coating the hem of her simple blue calico dress. Whispers already followed her. Mrs. Thornton and her daughter stood outside the millinery, their conversation halting abruptly as Harriet passed. "Poor thing," she heard Mrs. Thornton murmur. "What man would want her now?" Harriet quickened her pace, her eyes fixed on the small cabin at the edge of town where she'd lived alone since her father's passing last winter. At 24, she was already considered an old maid by most, and now, with the news of her condition, her prospects had dwindled to nothing. The cabin door closed behind her with a solid thud, and only then did she allow the tears to come. She slid down against the rough wooden door, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. A week passed. Then another. The whispers grew louder, transforming into outright gossip. Women who had once invited Harriet to their quilting circles suddenly found their gatherings too crowded. Men who had occasionally tipped their hats in polite greeting now averted their eyes, as if her condition might be contagious. Harriet threw herself into her work at the town's small schoolhouse, grateful that the children, at least, were oblivious to the town's judgment. But the parents weren't. When Mrs. Peterson came to collect her son and daughter one afternoon, her words cut deeper than any knife. "The school board is meeting tomorrow," she said, not quite looking at Harriet. "Some folks are wondering if someone in your situation should be teaching impressionable young minds." "My situation," Harriet echoed, her voice dangerously quiet. "Well, it ain't natural, is it? A barren woman teaching children might give the girls strange ideas about shirking their God-given duties." The schoolhouse emptied before Harriet could compose herself enough to respond. That night, she paced her cabin floor until dawn, then packed a small trunk with her essential belongings. By mid-morning, she'd withdrawn her meager savings from the bank and purchased a stage-coach ticket to Silver Ridge, a larger settlement 50 miles west. The journey was dusty and uncomfortable, the coach packed with travelers. No one spoke to her, which suited Harriet fine. She stared out at the passing landscape, the endless expanse of scrubland dotted with sagebrush and cactus, so different from the lush Pennsylvania countryside where she'd been born. Silver Ridge rose from the desert like a mirage as the sun began its descent. It was larger than Hollow Creek, with wooden buildings lining both sides of a wide main street. The stagecoach deposited her outside the Silver Spur Hotel, a 2-story structure with peeling white paint and a creaking sign. "Rooms 50 cents a night," the clerk told her, sliding a key across the counter. "Weekly rates $3. No gentlemen callers after 8. Harriet nodded, too exhausted to be offended. Her small room on the second floor had a narrow bed, a washstand, and a window overlooking the busy street below. She sat on the edge of the bed, suddenly overwhelmed by the magnitude of what she'd done. She'd fled the only home she'd known since coming west, with no plan beyond escaping the whispers. Morning brought clarity. Silver Ridge needed teachers. The notice in the hotel lobby said as much. By noon, Harriet had secured a position at the town's school, starting the following Monday. The school board chairman, Mr. Anderson, seemed more concerned with her credentials than her personal circumstances. "We've had 3 teachers come and go in the past year," he explained, his bushy eyebrows drawing together. "Mining town's no place for delicate constitution." "You look sturdy enough." Harriet wasn't sure if she should be flattered or insulted by his assessment, but she accepted the position gratefully. The pay was better than in Hollow Creek, and the school itself was a proper building rather than a converted barn. The Silver Star boarding house offered reasonable monthly rates, and by Sunday evening, Harriet was settled in a small but clean room, ready to begin her new life. No one here knew about her barrenness. No one whispered behind their hands when she passed. She could be just Miss James, the schoolteacher, and nothing more. Her optimism lasted exactly 3 weeks. Miss James, Mrs. Whittaker, the boarding house proprietress, intercepted her one evening as she returned from school. "There's a letter for you." Harriet's heart sank when she saw the Hollow Creek postmark. She carried it upstairs unopened, dread settling in her stomach like a stone. Finally, sitting at her small writing desk, she broke the seal. The letter was from Ida Peterson, the woman who had questioned her fitness as a teacher. The words swam before Harriet's eyes. "Felt it my Christian duty to inform your new employers of your condition, unsuitable influence on young women, perhaps better suited to other employment." The paper crumpled in Harriet's fist. She hadn't told the school board about her infertility because it hadn't seemed relevant. Now, the choice to disclose it had been taken from her. Mr. Anderson's expression the next morning confirmed that Mrs. Peterson's letter had found its mark. He waited until the children had been dismissed before approaching her desk. "Miss James," he began awkwardly, "it has come to our attention that well, that is to say, your medical condition." "My inability to bear children has no impact on my ability to teach," Harriet said firmly, though her heart hammered in her chest. Of course," he fumbled. "But parents are concerned. Young girls look to their teacher as an example of womanhood, you understand." "And what example would I be setting? That a woman's worth extends beyond her womb?" Mr. Anderson's face reddened. "The board has decided it would be best if we found another teacher. You'll be paid through the month, of course." Harriet didn't cry until she was back in her room at the boarding house. Then she wept until her throat was raw and her pillow soaked. When Mrs. Whittaker knocked on her door the following morning, her expression was a mixture of pity and discomfort. "I'm afraid I'll need your room by the end of the week, Miss James," she said, not meeting Harriet's eyes. "I run a respectable house and the other ladies are uncomfortable." Harriet nodded numbly. "Of course they are." 4 days later, Harriet found herself on another stagecoach, headed farther west toward the frontier town of Promise. The name seemed a cruel joke, but the settlement was so new and so desperate for civilizing influences that she hoped her condition might be overlooked. It wasn't. Over the next 2 years, Harriet moved from town to town across the Western Territories. Sometimes she managed to keep her secret for months before the whispers caught up with her. Other times, she barely had time to unpack her trunk. She worked as a teacher when she could, a shop girl when necessary, and once as a hotel maid. Each time the result was the same: discovery, whispers, rejection. "Useless," she'd heard a woman mutter in Willow Springs. "Can't even do what God made women for." By 1878, Harriet's savings had dwindled to almost nothing, and her spirit had been worn down to a nub. When the stagecoach stopped in the small settlement of Redemption, Colorado, she had barely enough money for a week's lodging. Redemption was barely more than a wide spot in the trail, a cluster of buildings serving the ranchers and miners in the surrounding hills. The Wayfarers Inn was the only lodging in town, a 2-story building that doubled as a saloon on the ground floor. Room's $1 a night, the proprietor told her, eyeing her threadbare traveling dress. Got one at the end of the hall upstairs. Harriet counted out 7 precious dollars. For the week, then, suit yourself. What brings you to Redemption, miss? Ain't many single ladies passing through. I'm looking for work, she said simply. He scratched his beard. Might try the Golden Eagle. They need a girl to serve drinks since Mary Beth ran off with that drummer last month. Or Miller's General Store sometimes needs help. Harriet thanked him and climbed the narrow stairs to her room. It was small but clean, with a narrow bed and a washstand. She sat heavily on the edge of the bed, exhaustion seeping into her bones. 7 days. She had 7 days to find work in Redemption before she'd be truly destitute. The Golden Eagle Saloon was not Harriet's first choice, but Miller's General Store had no positions available. The saloon owner, a surprisingly refined woman named Frances Harding, looked Harriet up and down with a critical eye. Ever served drinks before? No, Harriet admitted. But I learn quickly. Pays $2 a week plus whatever tips you earn. No entertaining the customers upstairs, this ain't that kind of establishment. Start tonight at 6. It wasn't teaching, but it was honest work. Harriet swallowed her pride and accepted. The Golden Eagle was crowded that evening with ranch hands and miners spending their hard-earned wages. Harriet balanced trays of whiskey and beer, dodging wandering hands and ignoring crude remarks. By midnight, her feet ached and her back burned with fatigue, but her apron pocket jingled with coins from tips. She continued this way for 3 weeks, working from dusk until the early hours of the morning, collapsing into her bed at the Wayfarer's Inn, then rising at noon to begin again. No one in Redemption knew her secret, and she intended to keep it that way. Then the cattle drive arrived. The O-Bar-P Ranch was one of the largest in the area, and their spring cattle drive to the railhead had just concluded. The cowhands descended on Redemption like a dust storm, flush with pay and thirsty for whiskey. The Golden Eagle was packed to the rafters, and Harriet moved between tables in a constant blur of motion. She was delivering a tray of drinks to a table of rowdy ranch hands when one of them grabbed her wrist. "Well, ain't you a pretty little thing?" he slurred, his breath reeking of cheap whiskey. "How about you take a break and sit on my lap for a spell?" "Please release me, sir," Harriet said firmly, trying to pull away. His grip tightened. "Don't be like that, sweetheart, just being friendly-like. The lady asked you to let go." The voice came from behind her, deep and steady. The drunk cowboy's eyes flicked up, and his grip loosened enough for Harriet to pull free. She turned to see her defender, a tall man with broad shoulders and a weathered face partially hidden beneath the shadow of his Stetson. His eyes, a startling shade of blue, were fixed on the drunk cowboy with unmistakable warning. "Mind your own business, Paine," the drunk muttered. "Miss Harding has rules about how her girls are treated," the tall man said evenly. "You're welcome to drink here, Jacobs, but keep your hands to yourself." Jacobs muttered something under his breath but turned his attention back to his drink. Harriet nodded gratefully to her defender before hurrying back to the bar. "Who is that man?" she asked Frances as she collected another round of drinks. "Owen Paine," Frances replied, glancing over Harriet's shoulder. "Foreman at the O-Bar-P, good man, keeps his boys in line most times." Harriet delivered drinks to 2 more tables before circling back to where Owen Paine sat alone, nursing a glass of whiskey. His eyes tracked her movements across the room. "Thank you for your intervention earlier," she said, stopping at his table. "No thanks needed, madam." Some men forget their manners when they've been on the trail too long. His voice had a slight drawl that suggested Texas origins. "Can I get you another drink, Mr. Paine?" He shook his head. "No, thank you, Miss James, Harriet James, Miss James." He tipped his hat slightly. "You're new to Redemption." It wasn't a question, but Harriet answered anyway. "Yes, just a few weeks. Teaching position bring you here?" Harriet blinked in surprise. "How did you know I was a teacher?" A slight smile curved his lips. "You've got that look about you. Too educated for slinging drinks in a place like this." Life doesn't always turn out as expected, Mr. Paine. No, he agreed, his blue eyes holding hers. It surely doesn't. Harriet felt a flutter in her chest that she immediately tried to quash. Men like Owen Paine weren't interested in women like her women who couldn't fulfill the most basic duty of a wife. She nodded politely and moved on to the next table, but throughout the evening, she felt his gaze following her. The next night, Owen Paine returned to the Golden Eagle, and the night after that. He always sat alone, nursed a single whiskey, and watched the room with observant eyes. When Harriet served him, their conversations were brief but pleasant. Unlike most of the patrons, he looked at her face when speaking to her, not at her bodice. "Will you be staying in Redemption long?" she asked on his fourth visit. "The ranch keeps me nearby most of the year," he replied. "You planning on staying?" Harriet hesitated. "For now." Something in her tone must have revealed more than she intended, because his expression turned thoughtful. "Redemption's not much, but it grows on you. Folks here mind their business mostly." A week later, Harriet was walking back to the Wayfarers Inn after her shift when she heard hoofbeats behind her. She turned to see Owen Paine on a handsome chestnut gelding. "Evening, Miss James," he said, tipping his hat. "Shouldn't be walking alone at this hour." "I've managed thus far, Mr. Paine. Just the same, I'd feel better seeing you safely to your door." He dismounted and fell into step beside her, leading his horse by the reins. In the moonlight, she could see his features more clearly, the strong line of his jaw, the slight crinkles at the corners of his eyes suggesting he smiled often, though she'd rarely seen it. "Why have you taken an interest in my welfare, Mr. Paine?" Harriet asked directly. He seemed taken aback by her forthrightness, but answered honestly. "You remind me of someone. My sister Hannah, she came west with her husband years back, had that same look in her eye, determined but wary." "And where is your sister now?" A shadow crossed his face. "Died in childbirth 6 years ago, her and the baby both." "I'm sorry," Harriet said softly. They had reached the Wayfarers Inn. Owen stopped at the bottom of the steps, looking up at her as she climbed the first one. "Miss James," he said hesitantly, "would you allow me to call on you properly sometime? Perhaps Sunday after church?" Harriet's heart stuttered in her chest. "Mr. Paine, just for coffee at the hotel restaurant," he added quickly, in full view of the town's most respectable gossips. A small smile tugged at her lips despite her reservations. "That would be nice." His answering smile transformed his face, making him look younger and boyishly handsome. "Sunday at noon, then." Harriet watched him mount his horse and ride away, then pressed her hands to her warm cheeks. This was foolishness. She had no business encouraging a man's interest, not when she knew it could lead nowhere. Yet for the first time in years, she felt a spark of something dangerously close to hope. Sunday arrived with clear skies and a gentle breeze that carried the scent of wildflowers from the surrounding hills. Harriet wore her best dress, a dove gray cotton with modest lace at the collar and cuffs, and pinned her hair in a neat chignon. She attended the morning service at Redemption's small church, sitting in the back pew and slipping out before the congregation could engage her in conversation. Owen was waiting outside the hotel restaurant at precisely noon, his tall frame clad in clean denims and a pressed shirt, his hat in his hands. His eyes widened appreciatively when he saw her. "Miss James," he greeted, "you look lovely." The restaurant was nearly empty, the Sunday crowd having already dispersed after church. They sat at a small table by the window, sunshine spilling across the checkered tablecloth. "I realized I know almost nothing about you," Owen said after they'd ordered coffee. "Where are you from originally?" "Pennsylvania," Harriet replied. "My father moved us west after my mother died. He had dreams of starting over. And did he, in a way. He found work as a clerk in a mining office. It wasn't the grand adventure he'd imagined, but we managed. And now it's just you." Harriet nodded. "He passed 2 years ago. You've been traveling since then." "Yes." She sipped her coffee, avoiding his perceptive gaze. Running to something or from something, the question, asked gently but directly, caught her off guard. "Both, perhaps. Owen didn't press further. Instead, he told her about growing up on a small farm in Texas, about fighting in the war when he was barely 18, about drifting west afterward and finding work with cattle. He spoke of the Obar P Ranch with pride, describing the sprawling property in the foothills and the herd of prize Herefords the owner was cultivating. "You should see it sometime," he said, then colored slightly at his own presumption. "I mean, it's beautiful country." "I'd like that," Harriet found herself saying, surprised by her own sincerity. They talked until their coffee grew cold, then ordered fresh cups. Owen was easy to talk to, thoughtful and genuinely interested in her opinions. When he spoke of books he'd read, Harriet's surprise must have shown on her face. "What, you think cowboys can't read?" he teased. "Most I've met prefer other entertainments." "I had a good teacher growing up," he explained, "and long nights on the trail give a man time to think. Reading seems a better use of that time than cards or whiskey." By the time they finally left the restaurant, the afternoon was waning. Owen walked her back to the Wayfarers Inn, their pace deliberately slow. "I'd like to see you again, Miss James," he said at the bottom of the steps. Properly like today, Harriet hesitated. "Mr. Paine, Owen, please." "Owen," she corrected. "You should know that that is, my situation is not conventional." He raised an eyebrow. "In what way?" "I'm not like other women." The words stuck in her throat. "I'd noticed that much," he said with a slight smile. "It's part of why I'm standing here. You don't understand, then help me understand." But Harriet couldn't bring herself to say the words that would surely end whatever was beginning between them. Not yet. Another time, perhaps. He studied her face for a moment, then nodded. "I'll hold you to that. Good day, Miss James." "Harriet," she said impulsively. His smile widened. "Harriet." Over the next few weeks, Owen called on Harriet regularly. They took Sunday walks along Redemption's dusty streets, had coffee at the hotel restaurant, and once rode out to a meadow dotted with wildflowers where they shared a simple picnic. He was unfailingly respectful, never presuming more than she offered, but Harriet could feel herself falling for him despite her best efforts to guard her heart. The Golden Eagle's patrons noticed the foreman's interest in the new serving girl. Some made crude jokes when Owen wasn't present, which Harriet ignored. Frances Harding watched with knowing eyes but said nothing beyond a cryptic, "Be careful, girl. Hearts break easy out here." On a warm evening in late spring, Owen waited for Harriet after her shift ended. "I thought we might look at the stars," he suggested. "There's a perfect spot on a hill just outside town." They rode double on his gelding, Harriet seated before him, acutely aware of his strong arm around her waist to steady her. The night air was cool and fragrant with sage, and the stars above were a brilliant canopy against the velvet darkness. Owen spread his coat on the ground for them to sit on. For a long while, they simply gazed upward in companionable silence. "My pa taught me the constellations," Owen said eventually, pointing upward. "That there's Ursa Major the Great Bear, and over there is Cassiopeia." "They're beautiful," Harriet murmured. "In Pennsylvania, the trees often block the view. I've never seen the sky so clearly as out here." "That's the West for you. Everything's bigger, clearer." He turned to look at her, his face silvered by moonlight. "Harriet, there's something I need to say." Her heart began to race. "Owen, please let me finish." He took a deep breath. "I know we haven't known each other long, but I've never felt this way about anyone. You're unlike any woman I've ever met, smart, strong, kind. I find myself thinking about you when I should be focusing on ranch business. I look forward to seeing you more than anything else." "Owen, stop." Harriet stood abruptly, wrapping her arms around herself. "You don't know everything about me." He rose too, standing close but not touching her. "Then tell me, whatever it is, it won't change how I feel." The moment she dreaded had arrived. Harriet stared out at the darkened landscape, gathering her courage. "I can't have children," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "I had a fever as a child that damaged me. Doctors say I can never conceive." She waited for his shocked silence, for his muttered excuses, for the inevitable withdrawal she'd experienced so many times before. Instead, she felt his hand gently turn her to face him. "Is that all?" he asked softly. Tears sprang to her eyes. "Is that not enough? I'm barren, Owen." Useless as a wife, anger flashed across his face. "Who told you that you're useless? Everyone. Everywhere I've gone, they call me barren, damaged, incomplete. No man wants a woman who can't give him children." Owen's hands came up to frame her face, his touch infinitely gentle. "I want you, Harriet James, just you. You're all I'll ever need." "You say that now, but I say it knowing exactly what it means," he interrupted firmly. "I've known many men with children they never wanted, never cared for. Having children doesn't make a family, love does." A sob escaped her. "The world doesn't see it that way." "To hell with the world," Owen said fiercely. "I've never much cared what others think. I care what you think, what you feel." "I'm afraid," she admitted. "Afraid to hope, only to be rejected again when reality sets in." "I'm not going anywhere," he promised. "And neither are you if I have any say in it. Stay in redemption, Harriet. Stay with me." He kissed her then, under the vast canopy of stars, his lips warm and certain against hers. Harriet felt something inside her, something long frozen, begin to thaw. When they rode back to town, Harriet's mind was spinning. She wanted desperately to believe Owen meant what he said, that he truly didn't care about her condition, but years of rejection had taught her caution. "Think about what I've said," he told her as they reached the Wayfarers' Inn. "I'll come by tomorrow." She nodded, not trusting herself to speak. Sleep eluded her that night. By dawn, Harriet had made a decision. She would give Owen and herself a chance at happiness. But first, she needed him to truly understand what accepting her meant. He arrived at noon, his face lighting up when he saw her waiting on the hotel porch. "You're a sight for sore eyes," he said, taking her hand. "Walk with me," she asked. They strolled to the edge of town, where a small creek provided a measure of privacy. Harriet gathered her thoughts carefully. "Last night you said my inability to bear children didn't matter to you," she began. "It doesn't." "I need to be certain you understand what that means," she pressed. "No sons to carry on your name, no daughters to cherish, no little ones calling you Pa." Owen's expression grew serious. "Harriet, I've thought of little else since last night. I won't pretend I never imagined having children someday, but it was never the most important thing to me. What I want, what I need is a partner, someone to share my life with, to build a home with. That's you. And if people talk, if they call me useless, barren," his jaw tightened, "they won't, not where I can hear them. The world can be cruel, Owen. Then we'll face that cruelty together." He took both her hands in his. "Harriet James, I love you. I want to marry you if you'll have me. We can build a life together that's ours, not defined by what others expect." Tears welled in her eyes. "You truly mean that, with all my heart?" "Then yes," she whispered. "Yes, I'll marry you." The joy that transformed his face was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. He pulled her into his arms, lifting her off her feet in his exuberance. Harriet laughed, a sound of pure happiness she hadn't made in years. They were married 2 weeks later in Redemption's small church. Frances Harding stood as Harriet's witness, along with a few of the townspeople who had come to know and respect her. Owen's fellow ranch hands from the O-Bar-P filled the pews, their usually rowdy demeanor subdued by the solemnity of the occasion. Harriet wore a simple cream-colored dress with a blue ribbon at the waist, and Owen looked handsome in a new black suit. When the preacher pronounced them man and wife, Owen's kiss was a promise of all the years to come. The O-Bar-P owner had given them use of a small cabin on the ranch property, a wedding gift that Owen had spent days preparing for his bride. When he carried her across the threshold that evening, Harriet felt a sense of homecoming she hadn't experienced since childhood. The cabin was modest but cozy, with a small parlor, a kitchen, and a bedroom furnished with a handmade quilt and fresh wildflowers. Owen had built shelves for Harriet's beloved books and hung curtains at the windows. "It's perfect," she breathed, taking it all in. "It's just a start," he promised. "I aim to build you a proper house someday." That night, as they lay together in the darkness, Owen's arms around her, Harriet finally believed that she had found where she belonged. Life, as the wife of the Obar Pitikes foreman, was busy and fulfilling. Harriet tended their home, planted a small garden, and began teaching reading and arithmetic to some of the ranch hands who'd never had formal education. Owen's days were long, especially during calving season and roundups, but he always returned to her with the same look of wonder, as if he couldn't quite believe his good fortune. The expected whispers about her condition never materialized, whether because the people of Redemption were more accepting than those in other towns, or because Owen's reputation kept loose tongues in check. Harriet wasn't sure. What mattered was that for the first time since learning of her condition, she didn't feel diminished by it. 6 months after their wedding, Owen came home with an unexpected proposition. Richards at the Mercantile mentioned the town's looking to build a proper school, he said over supper. They're seeking a teacher. Harriet looked up from her plate, surprised. For Redemption, more children settling here with their families, mining camps becoming a proper town. He watched her carefully. I told him my wife was the finest teacher this side of the Mississippi. Owen, you didn't. I surely did, and I meant every word. He reached across the table to take her hand. You don't have to, of course. I know you've found peace here at the ranch, but I see how your eyes light up when you're teaching the boys their letters. Thought you might want the chance to do it proper like. Tears pricked at Harriet's eyes. You wouldn't mind if I took a position in town, mind. I'd be proud as punch to be married to Redemption's schoolmarm. His expression grew tender. Harriet, all I want is for you to be happy. Whatever form that takes. The school committee met the following week, and Harriet found herself facing a panel of Redemption's most prominent citizens. Their questions were focused entirely on her teaching experience and methods, with no mention of her personal circumstances. When Mr. Richards, the committee chairman, asked if she had any questions for them, Harriet took a deep breath and addressed the issue directly. I believe in transparency, gentlemen, she said. So you should know that I am unable to have children of my own. In other towns, this has been deemed problematic for a teacher. The committee members exchanged glances. Mrs. Paine, Mr. Richards corrected himself. This committee's concern is finding someone who can teach our children to read, write, and cipher. Your personal medical history is none of our business. In fact, added Mrs. Hollister, the only woman on the committee, I'd say your situation might be an advantage. No interruptions from your own little ones to distract from your teaching duties. Harriet could hardly believe what she was hearing. So my condition doesn't trouble you. The only thing troubling us, Mrs. Paine, is how long Redemption's children have gone without proper schooling, Mr. Richards said firmly. If you're willing to take on the position, we'd be much obliged. She accepted on the spot. The new school was a simple building with rows of desks, a pot-bellied stove for winter, and large windows to admit light. On the first day of classes, 28 students of varying ages filed in, their faces a mixture of curiosity, excitement, and in some cases trepidation. Good morning, Harriet greeted them. I'm Mrs. Paine, and I'll be your teacher. We have much to learn together. The work was challenging but deeply rewarding. Some children had never held a pencil before, others could read at advanced levels. Harriet adjusted her teaching to accommodate them all, staying late to help those who struggled and providing extra materials for those who excelled. The parents of Redemption embraced her as their children's teacher, bringing her small gifts of appreciation, a jar of honey, a loaf of fresh bread, hand-picked wildflowers. No one questioned her fitness for the role based on her inability to bear children. Owen beamed with pride when he escorted her to the first school social, where her students performed recitations and displayed their schoolwork for the town. Told you you'd be the best teacher they ever had, he whispered. As the months passed, Harriet and Owen settled into a rhythm of shared life. She taught during the day while he worked the ranch. Evenings were spent together in their small cabin, sharing the day's events and making plans for their future. They began saving to buy their own small property someday, a place that would be entirely theirs. One evening in early spring, nearly a year after their wedding, Owen returned from town with an unusual expression on his face. "Something happened today," he said carefully, setting his hat on its peg by the door. Harriet looked up from the student essays she was grading. "What is it?" "I met someone at the Mercantile, a woman named Mrs. Carlson. She just arrived on the afternoon stage with her husband and a situation." "What sort of situation?" Owen sat beside her at the table, taking her hands in his. "She has a baby, not hers by birth. The child's mother was her sister, who died in childbirth 2 months ago. The father abandoned them both when he learned the woman was expecting." "How tragic," Harriet murmured. "Mrs. Carlson and her husband took the baby in, but—" Owen hesitated. "They're elderly, Harriet, already raised their children. They came west hoping to find a family willing to take the child a good, loving home." Understanding dawned slowly. "Owen, are you suggesting—" "I told them about us," he rushed on. "About how we'd wanted children but couldn't have them naturally. About what a fine teacher you are, how good you are with children." Harriet's heart began to race. "What did they say?" "They'd like to meet you to see if we might be the right family for this little girl." "A girl," Harriet whispered. Owen nodded, his eyes bright with emotion. "A little girl, just 8 weeks old. They've called her Grace." Harriet's hands trembled in his. "You want this, truly?" "I want us to at least meet them, meet the baby. See if it feels right." He looked at her intently. "I meant what I said when I proposed, Harriet. You're all I need to be happy. But if we have the chance to give a home to a child who needs one, to be parents in a different way than we imagined, I'd like to consider it." Tears spilled down Harriet's cheeks. "Take me to them, now." The Carlsons were staying at the Wayfarers Inn. Mrs. Carlson, a silver-haired woman with kind eyes, greeted them warmly. In her arms was a small bundle wrapped in a soft blanket. "Would you like to hold her?" she asked Harriet gently. With trembling hands, Harriet accepted the infant. The baby was tiny, with a dusting of dark hair and rosebud lips. As Harriet cradled her, Grace opened her eyes deep blue, like the sky after a storm. "Hello, Grace," Harriet whispered, and the baby made a small cooing sound in response. Owen stood beside her, his hand warm on her shoulder as he gazed down at the child. Something passed between them in that moment, an unspoken understanding, a new beginning. The Carlsons watched them carefully. "We want to be sure she goes to a loving home," Mr. Carlson said. "We promised my wife's sister." "We understand," Owen assured them. "This isn't a decision to be made lightly." They spent hours talking, the Carlsons sharing what they knew of the baby's short life and her mother's history. There were papers to be drawn up, legal matters to address. But by the time Harriet and Owen left the hotel, a plan had been set in motion. 3 days later, after the town's lawyer had prepared the necessary documents, and the Carlsons had satisfied themselves that the Paines would provide a loving home, Grace became their daughter. The small cabin suddenly seemed transformed by the presence of the tiny new resident. Owen built a cradle with his own hands, working late into the night to finish it before Grace came home. Harriet sewed tiny gowns from soft flannel and arranged a corner of their bedroom as a nursery. News of the adoption spread quickly through Redemption. To Harriet's astonishment, the response was overwhelmingly positive. Women from town arrived with baby clothes, knitted blankets, and practical advice. The school board arranged for a young assistant to help in the classroom so Harriet could continue teaching while caring for the infant. "Seems the town approves," Owen remarked one evening as they sat together on the porch, Grace sleeping peacefully in his arms. "They've been so kind," Harriet agreed, still somewhat amazed. "Nothing like what I experienced before." "Maybe it's not the towns that were different," Owen suggested. "Maybe it's that you're finally somewhere you're seen for who you truly are, not defined by what you can or cannot do." Harriet considered this. "Or maybe it's that for the first time I'm not ashamed of who I am." Owen shifted Grace to one arm so he could take Harriet's hand with his free one. "You never had anything to be ashamed of. Those people who called you useless, they were wrong. You're the strongest, most valuable person I know." As if sensing she was being discussed, Grace stirred and opened her eyes, fixing her solemn blue gaze on Harriet. A tiny hand escaped from the blanket, and Harriet offered her finger, which the baby gripped with surprising strength. "She's perfect," Harriet whispered. "She is," Owen agreed. "And so are you, Harriet Paine, so are you." In the years that followed, the Paine family thrived in redemption. Owen eventually became part owner of the OBRP when the aging owner decided to retire east. Harriet continued teaching, becoming a beloved fixture in the community. Grace grew into a bright, spirited child with her adoptive father's blue eyes and her mother's love of books. When Grace was 3, the Carlsons came to visit, marveling at how the tiny infant they'd entrusted to the Paines had grown into a happy, healthy little girl. They brought news that surprised everyone. Grace had a biological brother, born to a young woman who had taken in Grace's mother during her last difficult months. "The child is just 6 months old," Mrs. Carlson explained. "His mother is struggling, unable to provide for him." When she learned about Grace, she wondered if perhaps the same family. Owen and Harriet exchanged a glance, no words necessary between them. 2 weeks later, baby Samuel joined their family, his arrival celebrated by the entire town. As the children grew, so did redemption. The mining camp transformed into a proper town with a church, a school, and eventually, a small library that Harriet helped establish. Their cabin was replaced by a comfortable house on a small ranch Owen purchased adjacent to the OBRP. Sometimes in the evening, when the children were asleep and the house was quiet, Harriet would think back to that bleak day in Hollow Creek when the doctor had delivered the news that had sent her fleeing across the West. The pain of those years had not disappeared entirely. There were still moments when an offhand comment about bloodlines or family resemblance would sting, but they had receded into the background of a life rich with love and purpose. On the 10th anniversary of their wedding, Owen surprised Harriet with a locket containing miniature portraits of Grace and Samuel. "Our family," he said simply, fastening it around her neck. Harriet touched the locket, tears in her eyes. "I never imagined this was possible. After I learned I couldn't have children, I thought no man would ever want me, that I'd never be a mother." "You're the finest mother those children could hope for," Owen said, drawing her into his arms. "And the finest wife a man could ask for. I meant what I said 10 years ago, Harriet. You're all I'll ever need." As the sun set over the Colorado foothills, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Harriet Paine stood in the circle of her husband's embrace and knew with absolute certainty that she was exactly where she belonged, not useless or incomplete, but whole, valued, and deeply loved. And if somewhere in the vastness of the Western Territories, there were still those who would judge her for what her body could not do, their voices no longer had the power to diminish the fullness of the life she had found in redemption.